For most of my career, I learned that survival in a company does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who keeps things working while everyone else sleeps. I arrived early, left late, and carried the weight no one noticed. Years passed like that. Systems stayed up. Crises disappeared before they reached executives. Success became invisible because nothing ever broke. I was never the person fighting for attention in meetings. I did not sell ideas with dramatic gestures or sharp phrases. I listened more than I spoke. I fixed problems quietly, documented everything carefully, and moved on. When something failed at 3 in the morning, I was already awake. When the office arrived the next day, the issue no longer existed. Silence became my signature, not because I lacked confidence, but because stability does not need applause. The servers were my responsibility long before they became fashionable topics on slides. They carried years of data, transactions, trust, and promises made to clients. I knew every warning sign, every weak point, every workaround that kept the business breathing. Outages were avoided by instinct and memory, not checklists. While others discussed strategy, I protected continuity. That difference mattered more than anyone understood. Recognition never followed. Promotions passed quietly. New faces arrived with louder voices and fresher language. They spoke of transformation, agility, and disruption, unaware that the foundation beneath them was old, patient, and carefully balanced. I watched them celebrate progress built on systems they had never touched. Experience does not announce itself. It waits to be tested. Politics never interested me. I did not align with factions or collect favors. I believed work would speak for itself. It usually does, but only to those who know where to listen. Management prefers confidence that performs well in presentations. They rarely notice confidence that works quietly in the background. Over time, my role shifted from respected to assumed, then from assumed to forgotten. Still, everything functioned. Deadlines were met. Clients stayed calm. Revenue flowed. Each success erased evidence of effort. In their eyes, nothing happening meant nothing was required. My absence in conversations became proof that my presence was unnecessary. That illusion grew stronger with every uneventful quarter. Then came the moment when experience was officially erased. A restructuring announced efficiency. A new direction promised speed. Titles changed. Responsibilities were redistributed. I was no longer essential on paper. Years of institutional memory were replaced by optimism and confidence. No one paused to ask what I actually held together. No one checked which knowledge lived only in one place. I walked through the building that day with the same calm I always carried. Nothing was broken. Screens glowed. Systems responded. The company felt secure inside its assumptions. I understood then how complete the misunderstanding was. They believed the absence of noise meant absence of risk. What I carried was not a title or authority. It was context. Years of decisions layered quietly on top of each other, forming a map no diagram could replace. I knew why certain shortcuts existed and which ones would collapse under pressure. I knew which warnings mattered and which were noise. That knowledge was never transferred because no one thought to ask for it. They assumed information lives in files, not in people. That assumption felt harmless until it wasn't. Experience ages quietly. It waits, accumulates, and holds structure together long after enthusiasm fades. When it is removed without care, consequences arrive patiently, never loudly, always precisely. They did not realize the company still ran on something they had never asked about. The shift began slowly, not with an announcement, but with a subtle change in the atmosphere of the building. One morning, I walked into a conference room and saw a young man rehearsing a presentation filled with bright colors, fast transitions, and words that promised transformation. He greeted me politely, though with the kind of politeness people offer when they assume you are part of an older world being gently moved aside. His confidence filled the room in a way that experience never tries to do. He was new, energetic, and certain of himself before he had even learned the layout of the servers. The leadership adored him immediately. He spoke in a style that impressed people who valued energy more than continuity. He introduced new expressions and frameworks every week. He declared that the company needed modernization. He said it with pride, as if the years that had kept the business alive deserved to be replaced rather than appreciated. He talked about innovation without asking how the existing infrastructure had survived this long without major failure. The applause he received came from people who preferred the idea of progress rather than the responsibility of understanding it. I watched him move through the office with the confidence of someone who assumed everything had always been easy. He presented complex ideas with simple phrases that sounded powerful but solved very little. At meetings, he placed diagrams on screens that looked impressive, though most of them ignored the actual structure of the systems. He never asked how we arrived at the architecture we had. He never wondered why certain decisions were made. He simply believed he was here to replace all of it with something cleaner and brighter. My presence in the room became less necessary. Questions that once came to me now went to him. Leaders who used to seek my judgment now waited for his slides. The room leaned toward novelty, ignoring the quiet weight of institutional memory. I felt the shift without feeling bitterness. It was not anger that settled in me. It was recognition. I had lived long enough to see this cycle repeat in different forms. Youth brings certainty. Age brings context. One is praised more loudly than the other. I sat on a bench across the street and watched the office through the windows. People moved through the floors with purpose, confident that everything was functioning as it always had. None of them realized that the automated systems still carried my fingerprints. Configurations, scripts, failovers, and routines I had written continued to run as they had for years. The silence inside the building depended entirely on patterns I had built over countless nights. Without maintenance, those patterns would not collapse immediately. They would weaken slowly, almost gently. While watching, I thought about the small events that signal a larger shift. A delayed response from a database. A minor synchronization failure. A routine job that hangs for a moment before completing. These hesitations are the first signs of stress. They are quiet, almost respectful, as if giving the organization a chance to remember what it overlooked. They are warnings offered without anger. The executives believed the transition would be smooth because nothing seemed wrong. They trusted silence as proof of stability. What they never understood is that silence can hide the beginning of a change that cannot be reversed once it starts. Systems do not collapse without sending a message. They begin with a pause so small that only someone with experience recognizes its meaning. Systems do not fail loudly at first. They hesitate. Long before the acquisition ever appeared on the horizon, the company had accumulated a collection of licenses that grew quietly in the background. They were approved during late nights, emergency upgrades, urgent patching cycles, and quiet expansions no one remembered except the person who handled them. These licenses formed the skeleton of the entire operation. They determined who controlled access, who could authorize maintenance, and who had the legal right to update the most sensitive components. They were not glamorous. They were not displayed in presentations. They were simply necessary. Over the years, every critical license had been assigned to a custodian. The position was never discussed during meetings. It was not an award or a title. It was an acknowledgement that someone had proven capable of handling responsibility without creating noise. In my case, the role began years earlier, when I was the only one available to manage a system that needed immediate renewal. From that moment on, updates and extensions were linked to my identity in the vendor records. The company relied on that arrangement because it worked. No one questioned it, and as time passed, no one even remembered it existed. These licenses were designed to prevent unauthorized changes. They required renewal authority that could not be transferred through casual signatures. Vendors insisted on continuity for security reasons. They needed a validated human link, someone who understood the infrastructure well enough to answer specific questions during audits. This requirement was so old that most of the younger staff assumed the company itself held the authority. They never realized the authority sat with individuals who had been present during the early build phases. That assumption became a blind spot. As the organization modernized, leaders focused on automation, dashboards, and new platforms, yet none of them examined the documentation that listed who controlled the systems beneath all those polished displays. Compliance teams filed the paperwork in folders that were rarely opened. Auditors checked timestamps and expiration dates without looking at the custodial names. Everyone trusted that the company owned its own infrastructure because ownership seemed obvious. They forgot that digital ownership depends on the person written into the agreement, not the person who gives the presentation. When the acquisition began, lawyers reviewed contracts with precision, but their attention was on liabilities, intellectual property, and financial obligations. They never imagined that operational continuity depended on a set of licenses linked to a single guardian. These documents did not appear on the slide decks shared with the acquiring firm. They did not appear in the risk reports. They did not appear in the executive summaries. They remained where they had always been, quietly doing their work in the background. I still remember watching the new hire present his vision for a modern infrastructure. His plan included revised authentication procedures, new identity systems, and a patch cycle he assumed he would control. He never asked who held the keys that granted or revoked access to the systems he wished to redesign. The executives applauded his confidence without realizing that confidence does not grant permission. A system may be modern, but its foundation still obeys the agreements written years earlier. The truth is simple. A server can be replaced. A storage unit can be upgraded. A network can be redesigned. None of it matters if the licenses that authorize these actions cannot be transferred without the custodial holder initiating the process. That requirement does not care about enthusiasm or rank. It cares only about the rules written into the contract. When my employment ended, no one reviewed those documents. They believed access was tied to hardware. They believed authority belonged to the organization itself. They never understood that the company owned the equipment, but not the rights that kept it alive. They owned the servers. I owned the permission. The first morning after my dismissal felt strangely quiet. I woke up at the same hour I always had, out of habit rather than obligation. For the first time in years, there were no alerts on my phone, no messages about overnight failures, no quiet requests from managers who relied on my stability. The silence felt unfamiliar, almost hollow, yet within that silence something settled inside me. It was not anger. It was not disappointment. It was the realization that I owed the company nothing more than clarity. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened the folder that held every document related to my custodial responsibilities. I had kept copies for reference, never imagining they would one day become evidence of how deeply the company depended on unacknowledged structure. I read through each agreement slowly. Every line reminded me that the organization had taken my work for granted while assuming my authority belonged to them by default. It did not. Authority follows the name on the document, not the name on the organizational chart. That morning, I finally understood what needed to be done. Not revenge. Not retaliation. Just a clear statement of what the company had forgotten. I opened a blank email and began writing with the same calm I used when drafting technical notes. I explained that key operational licenses were tied to my custodial identity. I noted that renewal responsibilities had not been transferred before my termination. I listed the systems that required authorized oversight. I described the potential risks of leaving these matters unattended. Each sentence was factual and precise. I did not raise my voice through the keyboard. I did not accuse anyone of negligence. I simply clarified the situation in language that could stand in a court without shaking. When I finished the explanation, I attached an invoice for the hours required to facilitate a lawful transition of the licenses. The amount was not symbolic. It reflected the value of expertise, documentation, and time. It represented work they had never taken the trouble to understand. I read the email twice, ensuring there was no emotional undertone, no frustration, no hidden message. I wanted it to feel like the quiet sound of truth landing in a room where people believed noise was the only form of authority. The invoice included clear terms, deadlines, and reference codes from the license providers. The instructions were written with absolute clarity to avoid any interpretation that this was a negotiation. It was a service required by compliance laws, and I was offering it in the most professional manner possible. When the email was complete, I leaned back and watched the cursor blink at the end of the last line. The moment carried a peaceful weight. This was not an attempt to force reconciliation. It was a reminder that knowledge has value even when people choose not to see it. I knew the message would travel quickly once it arrived. Executives would read it with confusion. Lawyers would read it with urgency. The young hire would read it with disbelief. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that the truth was now documented. I considered for a moment sending it to Human Resources, but I knew that department would treat it as a routine complaint. They would categorize it, file it, and allow it to gather dust beside other forgotten cases. That was not the destination this email needed. Clarity belongs in the hands of those who understand consequences. I placed the cursor over the recipient field, added the address that mattered most, and pressed send. I sent it to legal, not HR. The call from legal landed in the executive suite long before anyone understood what it meant. It arrived quietly, as most important messages do, and it carried a level of urgency that spread through the building in less than an hour. I was not there to witness the confusion, but people talk and conversations travel faster when fear begins to settle in the walls of a company. By noon, an emergency meeting had been scheduled in the boardroom on the top floor, a place I had walked past for years without ever being invited inside. The directors entered with folders pressed tightly under their arms. Some carried tablets loaded with financial projections. Others came with questions they were not yet ready to ask aloud. The atmosphere was tense, but not with anger. It was the tension of people who suddenly realize they have overlooked something essential. External counsel joined the meeting through a glowing screen at the center of the table. Their expressions were polite but firm, the kind of expressions lawyers use when they deliver truth without decoration. The attorneys began by reviewing the email I had sent that morning. They read it with the seriousness it deserved, stopping at specific passages to clarify the implications. They explained that the licenses tied to my custodial identity were not optional assets. They were legal instruments required for system continuity. They pointed out that the organization had allowed these instruments to remain dependent on a person rather than a position, and that proper transfer should have occurred before my employment ended. Silence filled the room as each director absorbed the message. As the discussion deepened, the acquiring firm requested confirmation that all core systems were legally accessible. The directors hesitated. For the first time, they understood they could not provide an answer. The lawyers moved to the next question, which concerned immediate compliance. Without my authorization, they explained, the company faced structural risk. The board realized that the smooth merger they had promised investors no longer looked smooth at all. The tone of the room shifted from confident optimism to quiet calculation. Managers were summoned to provide historical context. Some arrived with uncertainty written across their faces. They admitted they had never reviewed the custodial documentation. They admitted they had assumed ownership belonged to the organization, not to the individual assigned by the vendors. Each admission tightened the atmosphere. The young hire who had replaced me sat further down the table, no longer confident, no longer eager to speak. His plans looked small in that room, overshadowed by the practical reality he had never considered. External counsel reminded the board that failure to resolve the custodial issue could delay the acquisition indefinitely. The consequences were not abstract. They involved financial penalties, contractual breaches, and potential intervention from regulatory authorities. The directors listened with growing unease. They understood that the acquiring firm might reconsider the offer if the operational risks became too visible. They understood that the situation had grown larger than a simple administrative oversight. Throughout the meeting, voices remained controlled, but the energy in the room was unmistakable. Decisions that once felt straightforward now felt delicate. The board sought solutions, but each option depended on cooperation from a person who no longer worked in the building. They asked for records, and those records pointed to one name. They reviewed the audit trails, and those trails pointed to the same name. They examined the renewal history, and once again, the same name appeared. I was not in that room, yet my presence filled it. My documentation guided their questions. My absence shaped their conclusions. They realized that the person they removed quietly had held responsibility that could not be replaced by enthusiasm or presentations. That afternoon, for the first time since the restructuring began, the board spoke of me with precision rather than dismissal. In the silence that followed their final review, something shifted permanently. My name was finally spoken correctly. Once the urgency in the boardroom settled into a structured conversation, the full weight of what had been overlooked became clear. The acquisition team from the buying company requested a detailed audit of every operational backbone tied to the systems that processed financial data, customer information, and internal communications. They wanted to ensure complete compliance before moving forward. It was standard procedure for a transaction of this size. Yet the simplicity of the request exposed the complexity of the company's situation. The first audit revealed that several core licenses did not belong to the organization itself. They were tied to custodial identities that had never been transferred. My name appeared repeatedly throughout the documentation. The directors realized that a basic requirement for the acquisition was the lawful transfer of these licenses to the acquiring firm. Without that transfer, no technical assurance could be granted. Without assurance, no regulatory approval could proceed. And without regulatory approval, the acquisition remained frozen at the starting line. The auditors continued their review and quickly identified the second problem. The custodial agreements required active participation from the original holder. These contracts could not be reassigned automatically, nor could they be released by executives who lacked custodial authority. Vendor policies were strict, created to prevent unauthorized control of sensitive systems. The acquiring firm insisted that these requirements be respected. Every missing signature, every missing authorization, every unresolved identity match added pressure to the already tense environment. Transfer clauses presented another barrier. The agreements included specific steps for transitions, especially during structural changes. Each step demanded validation from the custodian, documentation of intent, and vendor confirmation. None of these steps had been initiated before my departure. The lawyers explained that ignoring these procedures could expose the company to legal penalties. The acquiring firm refused to take ownership of systems that were not fully compliant. They wanted assurance, not promises. They wanted documentation, not assumptions. As the review deepened, the auditors uncovered another issue. The absence of a valid custodian placed certain systems into a compliance freeze. This meant they could not be modified, upgraded, or integrated into a new platform until the custodial situation was resolved. The freeze also prevented the acquiring firm from performing their own security checks. Without those checks, they could not meet their own regulatory obligations. Each discovery tightened the timeline around the transaction. Deadlines approached. Requirements multiplied. Yet the simplest part remained unresolved. The executives hoped the problem might be minor. They believed they could persuade the vendors to overlook the custodial requirements. They believed they could use influence, reputation, or urgency to accelerate the process. None of these beliefs survived the first call with vendor compliance officers. The rules were explicit. The vendors reminded the company that procedural stability matters more than ambition. They emphasized that custodial identity protects continuity and cannot be brushed aside for convenience. The acquiring firm grew increasingly cautious. Their legal team prepared assessments outlining the risks. The financial team recalculated the potential delays. Their senior leaders questioned whether the company they intended to purchase had the internal structure necessary to support growth. Confidence, once abundant, began to dissolve into careful doubt. They wanted clarity, not speculation. They wanted guarantees, not reassurances. None of that could be offered. Meanwhile, the directors struggled to explain how they had allowed such a critical oversight. Years of dependence on quiet performance had created a dangerous narrative inside the building. People believed systems functioned because they were simple. They believed continuity required no attention. They believed experience could be replaced with enthusiasm. The acquisition forced them to confront how fragile that belief had been. Every hour that passed revealed more complications. Workloads increased. Expectations tightened. Timelines shrank. Yet the core issue remained untouched because the one person who could resolve it no longer worked in the building. The clock did not care about urgency or optimism. It moved forward with quiet accuracy, marking the distance between intention and reality. And as it moved, the truth became impossible to ignore. The clock did not stop. The deal did. There was a long pause before he asked for help. It was not a demand. It was not an instruction. It was a request spoken by someone who once believed he held complete control. The silence that followed his question was not meant to punish him. It was simply the natural result of years spent watching decisions made without comprehension. I allowed that silence to exist because it belonged to him, not to me. It carried the weight of choices he had made and the consequences he now faced. He tried again, this time with a different tone. He spoke about the future of the company, the importance of preserving jobs, the need for stability. He explained that the acquiring firm needed immediate reassurance. He repeated that no one had realized how important the custodial agreements were. He spoke as if understanding had arrived overnight, though the truth was that the warnings had been visible for years. Still, he continued with a sincerity that did not feel false, only late. I did not insult him. I did not remind him of the meetings he ignored or the expertise he dismissed. I did not mention the young hire he placed above me or the restructuring that erased decades of contribution. I did not recount the long nights when I kept the systems alive without recognition. These things no longer held power. What mattered was the clear truth he had finally reached. Some responsibilities cannot be replaced by optimism. Some systems do not respond to ambition. Some knowledge lives only in the hands of the person who earned it. He waited for my response. The room around me was quiet. Outside, the light began to fade, washing the walls with a soft glow. I realized that I did not feel triumph. I did not feel resentment. What I felt was distance. A distance created not by anger, but by understanding. Once dignity is regained, revenge loses its purpose. What remained was clarity. I answered him calmly, with the steadiness he had never noticed when I worked under his leadership. I told him that the situation he described was the result of choices made without curiosity. I told him that structure matters more than confidence. I told him that consequences arrive when truth is ignored for too long. I said all of this without raising my voice. Then I ended the call gently, leaving him with the silence he had created around himself for years. Silence reveals what pride conceals. Respect always arrives late when it is forced. The morning after the call from the chief technology officer, the building entered a state of controlled urgency. The directors arrived early, some carrying fresh folders, others carrying the consequences of the previous day's revelations. The acquiring firm had sent a formal notice requesting immediate clarification regarding custodial authority. Their language was polite, but the undertone was unmistakable. Either the company resolved the issue at once, or the acquisition would be suspended indefinitely. The directors felt the pressure settle like weight across their shoulders. The first decision came quickly. The leadership understood that someone had to take responsibility for the failure to review the custodial documentation. The chief technology officer, once confident in his position, became the obvious focal point. He had championed modernization without understanding its foundation. He had dismissed the expertise he relied on without knowing he relied on it. During a closed session, the board voted to remove him. The announcement was delivered quietly through an internal message that offered no explanation. It simply stated that new technical leadership would be appointed. His departure signaled to the acquiring firm that the board recognized the seriousness of their oversight. With that decision complete, the directors turned their attention to the largest obstacle remaining. The licenses that governed system access were legally tied to my custodial identity. Without cooperation from the custodian, no transition could proceed. The lawyers advised the board that the only solution was to reach a settlement that acknowledged the custodial obligations and compensated the custodian for the work required to restore compliance. They reviewed the email I had sent and examined the invoice attached to it. The terms were reasonable, clear, and fully aligned with industry standards. The lawyers noted that refusal would only increase their liability. Meetings continued throughout the day. The directors discussed the financial implications of delaying the acquisition. They considered the cost of renegotiating terms, the risk of losing the acquiring firm's interest, and the potential damage to their reputation. Every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. The settlement was not optional. It was necessary, not as an act of generosity, but as a corrective measure to restore stability. The board approved the payment without hesitation. The next step involved formalizing the agreement. Legal counsel drafted a transition plan outlining the custodial transfer, the required interactions with the vendors, and the timeline for restoring compliance. The language was precise. It left no room for ambiguity. The directors reviewed the draft with meticulous attention. They understood that any error could further delay the merger. The acquiring firm received a copy and responded with cautious approval. They wanted confirmation that the custodian had accepted the terms. The board assured them that the matter was being resolved. When the settlement was finalized, the payment was issued immediately. There was no ceremony, no expression of appreciation, no acknowledgement of the years of service that had protected the organization from failures they never witnessed. The transaction was treated as a necessary step, nothing more. The directors believed that swift compliance would demonstrate responsibility. They preferred efficiency to reflection. They preferred closure to conversation. Throughout these decisions, I remained at a distance. I did not attend meetings. I did not speak with executives. I did not offer advice unless asked through the proper channels. The process unfolded exactly as it needed to. The company learned a lesson without theatrics. The consequences arrived quietly, shaped by structure rather than emotion. The leadership moved forward with the compliance plan, relieved that the acquisition was back on track. They restored order by accepting the terms they once ignored. The settlement and the transition represented the closest thing to accountability the organization would ever show. They did not apologize. They complied. The day I completed the final custodial transfer, I walked out of the vendor office with a sense of stillness I had not felt in years. There was no celebration waiting for me, no colleagues offering thanks, no recognition for the work that had held the company together long before the acquisition ever existed. Instead, there was a quiet afternoon sun, a soft breeze, and the feeling of a chapter closing without force. The work was done. The responsibility was complete. What remained belonged entirely to the people who had once believed they could move forward without understanding the foundation beneath them. As I stepped into the parking lot, I realized how different this ending felt from the day security revoked my access. That day had carried a hint of disbelief, a reminder that loyalty is not always valued and that experience can disappear from someone's memory faster than it disappears from the systems built upon it. But today was not about loss. It was about recognition. Not from others, but from myself. The choices I made in silence had shaped the path that followed. The steps I took without applause had become the very steps the company now depended on. Walking to my car, I did not think about the settlement or the invoice. Those were formalities. They compensated labor, not legacy. What mattered more was the clarity that had settled inside me. I understood the difference between contribution and visibility. I understood that a career is not measured by who notices your work, but by what remains standing after you leave the room. That realization carried a peace I had not expected. It felt like closing a door without locking it, simply allowing the past to stay where it belonged. I also took with me a new sense of boundaries. For years, I had allowed responsibility to expand beyond recognition. I carried burdens that were never acknowledged because I believed the work itself was enough. I believed stability would speak for me. But stability is quiet, and quiet work is easy to overlook. As I reflected on everything that had unfolded, I understood that boundaries are not barriers. They are lines that protect dignity. They are reminders that service must be balanced with self-preservation. Without boundaries, dedication becomes invisible. With them, it becomes a choice rather than an expectation. Driving away from the building, I thought about the long nights I had spent inside those walls. Nights when systems faltered, and I restored them before anyone realized there had been a problem. Nights when the servers hummed like a heartbeat, steady and loyal. Nights when I believed that reliability would be rewarded. Those memories no longer held regret. They held value. Not because anyone acknowledged them, but because they represented a skill and a discipline that had guided me through every stage of my career. Quiet preparation is a form of strength, even when no one sees it. I also carried with me something more subtle. Proof. Proof that arrogance can collapse under the weight of truth. Proof that confidence without understanding is fragile. Proof that the loudest voice in the meeting room is rarely the one keeping the company alive. The events surrounding the acquisition revealed what many never grasp. Systems are not loyal to ambition. They follow structure, documentation, and continuity. The people who maintain that continuity are often the ones dismissed first, until the moment their absence becomes undeniable. As I reached the highway, I felt no desire to look back. Not out of bitterness, but out of completion. I had given the company everything required to move forward. I had honored the systems I built. I had acted with integrity when others acted with haste. And in return, I gained something more valuable than recognition. I gained a new understanding of my own worth. Experience is not measured by applause. It is measured by resilience. It is measured by the ability to stand firm without needing approval. It is measured by the quiet certainty that preparation will always outlive noise. Experience isn't loud. It's positioned. If you are listening at this stage of life, I want to speak to you directly. You already know that work changes as the years pass. You know what it feels like to watch younger faces enter the room with voices that rise faster than their understanding. You know the quiet ache of being overlooked even though the structure beneath their confidence was built by your hands. You know the difference between noise and substance. You know the distance between enthusiasm and mastery. You have lived long enough to understand that what lasts is rarely what demands attention. There comes a time in every career when you must decide whether to chase relevance or design leverage. Relevance is temporary. It depends on trends, popularity, and the illusion that visibility equals value. It fades the moment a louder personality enters the room. Leverage is different. Leverage lives in structure, in knowledge, in preparation, and in the invisible lines that hold an organization together. It does not need applause. It does not need validation. It waits patiently for the moment when people realize what you have carried all along. Professionals over 50 understand this truth more deeply than any training session could teach. You have seen crises unfold. You have rebuilt systems others assumed were simple. You have prevented disasters long before leadership realized a disaster was possible. You have documented what others forgot. You have become the quiet force that holds continuity in place while newer voices perform confidence. You carry memory, context, and discipline. These qualities do not age. They become sharper with time. When someone younger dismisses your contribution, remember that dismissal does not erase reality. Expertise cannot be replaced by enthusiasm. Experience cannot be replaced by ambition. Systems do not respond to energy. They respond to understanding. And understanding belongs to those who have lived through the evolution of the work, not those who arrived when the story was already written. You do not need to argue with people who underestimate you. You do not need to fight for recognition in rooms that prefer volume over clarity. You do not need to defend your relevance to individuals who do not yet understand what relevance truly means. Instead, focus on your structure. Organize your work with precision. Document your knowledge. Build frameworks that outlast your presence. These quiet acts shape a leverage that cannot be removed by a decision made in haste. And when change arrives, as it always does, remain calm. Calm is a form of strength. Calm allows truth to reveal itself without your intervention. Calm allows others to face the consequences of choices they made without understanding the weight of what they touched. Calm allows you to walk away with dignity while the systems you shaped teach the lessons you no longer need to explain. Professionals over 50 know that legacy is not created through loud declarations. Legacy is created through the structures you leave behind. Structures that hold. Structures that endure. Structures that remind people, long after you have left the room, that stability does not come from noise. It comes from preparation. It comes from patience. It comes from the experience that cannot be imitated. So when the moment arrives when someone decides you are no longer essential, do not chase their approval. Step back. Let the structure speak. Let the systems reveal what they never took the time to learn. Let your preparation become the mirror that reflects their oversight. And remember this one truth that time teaches better than any mentor. If they replace you without understanding you, let them discover you through consequences.